Really and truly want you to recognize that this is of huge historical significance. The people who are Holocaust survivors are getting older. The chances of these presentations will be fewer going forward. So you are an incredibly fortunate group to have access to this. So I really need you to be on your most attentive in respect of the historical benefit that you're accruing from being here this morning. So without further ado, Tommy, you are most welcome to Kinsale Community School.
Good morning. It's a great privilege that I have to speak in this talk to so many students, and you are all welcome. Of course, for me, it's very important that I have the opportunity to speak to young people, especially, because you will be carrying the memory of the Holocaust and the Holocaust survivor. As mentioned, we are all getting very old, and in the next 15-20 years, none of us will be left around. So it will be you that will be carrying the memory of the Holocaust. And for me, it's very important as well for the reason that I lost 35 members of my family in the Holocaust, and therefore I owe it to them and to the victims that their memory is not forgotten. And the only way that I can do that is speaking to young people, and that's that way we can keep the memory as well. And I was very privileged today to unveil the little bench from the synagogue of Cork. That was a very significant event as far as I'm concerned, because as mentioned, 400 families landed here, but today there are only very few left in Cork, Jewish people, and in the next couple of years there will be nobody. And this bench will remind the student, the next generation, that actually Jewish people lived here, not far from the place. So it's very important, and of course I'm thanking the principal for arranging the plaque. It's a great honor. It as well will mention my name and that I was a Holocaust survivor visiting this school. Of course, I want to thank Patrick to organize my visit here, and as mentioned, we had a very packed audience yesterday, and I see it's packed again. The lecture will be around an hour. I don't know if we will have any time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. If you have, I would be delighted to answer. Unfortunately, I brought a lot of books with me, but I sold them off, so I have no books to sell you. But I think one of the teachers will make arrangement here. If anybody wants the book, just give the name to the teacher, and they will send me the name. I will dedicate the book to you, and then you can arrange the payment for the book. Is €15, and they will arrange to pass it to me. So that's in a nutshell. So we have to remember that Holocaust is not only about 6 million Jews that perished. Holocaust is about survivor as well. And this is a story, of course, that you don't learn about. You basically learn about the tragedy of the Jews of Central Europe and Eastern Europe, and I'm speaking about survival because I survived the Holocaust. Holocaust, as I mentioned, is not only about 6 million Jews perishing. Holocaust is about racism, about loss of freedom, about loss of dignity, humiliation, loss of education, confiscation of property, enslavement, starvation, torture, mass execution, and then of course the final solution to the Jewish question, which was decided at the Wannsee Conference in Germany on 20th of January 1942. There were 15 high-ranking officers and officials from the government sitting to a dinner. They drank the best brandy and they smoked cigar, and within less than an hour they decided the fate of the entire Jewish population of Europe. And their decision was to eradicate the entire Jewish population of Europe. And they nearly succeeded. They managed to kill, out of 11 million Jews that lived at the time in Europe, they managed to kill 6 million. Among them, as I mentioned, there were 35 members of my family. They were uncle, aunts, cousin, people that I knew very well that used to come to our village and spend their annual holiday with us. I used to play with my cousin. I knew them well. One day we said goodbye and we never saw them again. I was born in Slovakia. I'm living now in Ireland over nearly 60 years. I'm Jewish and I'm a Holocaust survivor. We lived in Slovakia in a small village, the villages like we have here in Ireland, and we were very liked in the village. We lived in the village for generations. It is estimated that, not estimated, but I followed the family tree and I was able to go back to late 1700s. So we lived for hundreds of years in Slovakia, and we consider ourselves as Slovak citizens. As I said, we were very much liked in the village. Anybody wanted any advice, they always came to my father, who was a farmer. My grandfather had a village shop, so we knew everybody, and everybody knew us. The population was there about 700 people, and we never felt any discrimination. But all this began to change in 1939, when Germany invaded Czech Republic. They annexed Sudetenland, and they imposed a puppet government in Slovakia. He wasn't elected by Slovak people. He was imposed by the German. He was a sympathizer of the Nazi regime. His name was Joseph Tisson. He was a Roman Catholic priest. And he was a big anti-Semite. He didn't like the Jews. And he surrounded himself with extremists, right-wing extremists. So immediately with his inauguration, the hatred, the propaganda began against the Jews in Slovakia. But at the time, the information system was very primitive in Slovakia. There was no internet, television, and if you were in possession of a radio, you were considered a middle-class person. So, and newspaper, they arrived into the village several days later when somebody was passing, and we would see what the news are in the world, what is happening. So the propaganda was spread through the churches. At the masses, they would preach that all the trouble that Slovakia is going through, it's the fault of the Jews. The people basically were very religious, especially in the rural area. Slovakia was a very Roman Catholic state and is still today, and people believed what they were being told. And as I said, they were basically very good people, but they were fed this propaganda and poisoned their mind, and so slowly a hatred of Jews began. And it didn't take long. It was in September 1941 that first anti-Jewish laws, racial laws, were introduced in Slovakia. It was called the Jewish Codex. It had 270 paragraphs restricting the life of the Jews. I will just mention a couple of the things that we were forbidden or we had to do. First of all, we had to wear a yellow star from the age of 5. And we were not allowed to go to any public places like cinema, theater, swimming pool, public park. We were not allowed to go to national school. We were not allowed to be employed. The property was beginning to be confiscated from the Jews. People that had working places were sacked. So the persecution was quite severe and life began quite difficult. I have a page of a newspaper, Slovak newspaper, that was of course written in Slovak. I translated it into English, but this half the page looked, it is dated Bratislava, 21st September 1941. And you can see the headline, the last door for the Jew, the strictest racial law against the Jews are Slovak. In certain aspects, the Slovak anti-Jewish laws are stricter than the German ones. They refer to the Nuremberg law. So they were actually proud what they did against their own citizens. We were Slovak citizens, and suddenly we were ostracized from the Slovak society. And there is also a caricature which shows a book, Jews falling out, and a Jew is looking up, signifying that the legal law no longer covered the Jews. So you can imagine after a headline like this, there were some pogroms in Slovakia, Jews were being beaten up on the street, there were a couple of fatalities as well, their properties was being damaged, and yet we couldn't complain because the legal law did not cover us. So even if somebody went to the police and was complaining, they wouldn't help us anyway. So I was at the time 6-year-old in 1941, and I was immediately kicked out of the school because the school in the village was a national school. As a Jew, I was not allowed to be in that school. I was kicked out and sent to a neighboring town where my aunt lived, and I went to a Jewish school because there was quite a large Jewish population, so there were a couple of Jewish schools. In the village I never wore the yellow star because everybody knew us anyway, and there was no police to enforce the law. And so I didn't know anything what is happening around, for the simple reason that the parents never told me. They didn't want it to frighten me. I was only a little kid. And therefore I didn't know anything. And I was very innocent. So when I went to the town there, the Jewish people usually lived in certain part of the town, so the police would be all around to make sure that the Jews are wearing the star and behaving according to the law that was now introduced in Slovakia. And so in the evening I saw my aunt sewing the yellow star on my coat. We had to wear it on the left side, and I was so innocent. I asked my aunt, "What is that for?" And she said, "We are Jewish, we have to wear a star." And I didn't question it, and because, okay, we have to wear it, so I will wear it. So the next morning, my aunt took me to the school, and so she did about 2 or 3 times, because we lived in certain part of the town, the community hall, the synagogue, the school, everything was very near, and the school from the house was about 300 yards. So after 3 days, my aunt said to me, "You know where the school is, you can go on your own." And I never knew that we are hated or anything, and this was the first time that I found out that because I'm a Jew, I was being hated. And when I was going on my own to the school, and children were going to school without the yellow star, obviously Gentile, they started to shout at me, "You dirty Jew, you smelly Jew, go to Palestine," and all kind of insult that I can't even mention. So it was first time that I suddenly realized I'm different and people hating me. And with time they become more aggressive. They would try to spit at me, they would try to catch me, which they did a couple of times. They gave me a couple of kicks in my backside and let me go. They would throw a stone after me. I used to come to my aunt crying, "I don't want to go to school, I'm being abused on the way." But of course it wasn't an option. We had to go to school. I was taught I have to learn. But unfortunately, with all this hatred of the Jewish people, eventually they began to arrest, first of all, young men and women, and also the deportation began from Slovakia to Poland and to Germany, to concentration camp. And of course, as I mentioned, the first were the young people, so our teachers were arrested as well. And it was about February 1942 that we were told that the teacher were taken away, and therefore the school closes. And so my education ended. The next time I went to school was in end of 1945, after the Second World War. And I will never forget that time. I had to go to classes with 6-7-year-old children. I was already at the time 10-year-old. So you can imagine at that age, 1 year makes a huge difference. It was very embarrassing because I couldn't read, I couldn't write, I couldn't do any mathematics. I had to start from the bottom. And I was already 10-year-old, so being with these kids in the class was very difficult, very embarrassing. And my childhood wasn't like anybody else's childhood. When the children were playing outside, I used to sit and I had to learn because I wanted to catch up with my age and get moved from the classes upward. It took me 2 years before I joined my own age in the school. But I must say, with all the setback and everything, I managed to study and I went to college. I got a diploma engineer I made, and then I had my own business. So in my adult life I was quite successful, and I did very well despite my setback that happened to me. But as I said, the deportation started in Slovakia in 1942. There were about 85,000 Jews. With the deportation, which lasted about 6-7 month there were 52 transports that left Slovakia with 1,000 to 1,500 Jews in every transport. It's about 58,000 were deported in 1942 from Slovakia. According to the statistic, from the 58,000, only between 280 and 500 survived. The rest of them all perished in the Holocaust. In fact, the Slovak Jewry was the first, they were the first Jews that were gassed in Auschwitz. They had to postpone the transport by about 3 weeks because the gas chambers were not ready. Once they were ready, all the transport, they went straight to Auschwitz and to the gas chamber. Among them, as I said, were 35 members of my family. We didn't know at the time what happened to them, but unfortunately, they all perished in the Holocaust. After 6 months, in October 1942, the deportation stopped. But at the time of the deportation, mostly Jews that were not useful to the economy were being taken. Because my father was a farmer, he was considered useful to the Slovak economy, and therefore we received a document that stated that we shouldn't be taken away because we're useful. And there were different professions as well. For example, my uncle was one of my uncles, he was an architect. He also got this document that he shouldn't be taken for the time being because he was important for the Slovak economy. At the time, Slovakia cooperated with Germany very well. When the war broke out on the Polish border, Slovakia served the German by providing the train of Slovakia. They were transporting the ammunition, the heavy equipment, tanks and guns from Germany to the Polish border. This was good cooperation as far as Slovakia was concerned because the German paid for it. Slovakia had not much industry, and that's helped economically. Also, over 100,000 Slovak young men and women worked as volunteers in Germany, were working and helping with the war reform. So the government in Slovakia was a fascist government, was a dictatorial government. So even the Slovak people hated the government because as a dictator, anybody that belonged to different political outlook or talked against the government, spread some rumors, was being arrested and sometimes never seen again. So many Slovak suffered, and the people of Slovakia began to hate the Tiso regime. And so, with this time, in Slovakia, the hatred was in such a high state that eventually the Slovak people rebelled against the Tiso regime. And many soldiers defected from the army and joined the rebellion, and many policemen joined the rebellion as well and defected. So Tiso couldn't defeat this uprising. Slovakia, in fact, was not occupied by Germany, while the rest of Europe was being occupied, because Slovakia was a friendly neighbor of Germany, and the Germany even used it for propaganda purposes, saying if a state is friendly with us, we don't want to occupy it. And so Slovakia was not occupied. Anything that happened in Slovakia was done by the Slovak regime. And the rebellion started in end of August 1944. But at the time, as I mentioned, Tiso couldn't suppress this uprising, so for the first time, Germany occupied Slovakia. And they suppressed the uprising. It took about 2 to 3 weeks. Many Slovaks died in this uprising, but of course they couldn't compete with the German army. And once we saw that Slovakia was occupied by Germany, we knew that this document will be not worth the paper, because the Slovak police and the German police will begin to work together. They will become very efficient and eventually able to arrest the remainder of the Jews, which were about 25,000 still in Slovakia. And therefore we decided that we have to leave the village because everybody knew us. Most of the people were very friendly, but there were also people, we didn't know who was our friend, who was our enemy, and we knew that sooner or later we will be betrayed. And at the time, in 1944, already the adult among us, they knew about the gas chamber, they knew about the massacres in Poland, in Auschwitz, and in different extermination camps like Lublin and other extermination camps. So we knew that we have to somewhere go and hide where nobody will know us. The problem was that with our name we couldn't have moved very easily. Reichental is a German name, but of course we were not German. So if we had to identify ourselves, they would know immediately that we were Jewish. And so the family friend in the village was the local priest. He was a very good man. And my parents used to go to him every week. And they used to play cards, and they used to have a social drink. And one day my mother asked father, it was his name was Ladislav Harangozo. He said, Father Harangozo, we would like you to help us. We need false paper, because with the name like Reichental we can't move anywhere. Everywhere there was police and you had to identify yourself. Can you help us? And he did. He obtained for us false paper. And the name was Vida. It was a typical Slovak name, like we have Murphy in Ireland. It's a typical Irish name. And with this document we could move. We had to identify ourselves because they would think that we are Slovak people. And I remember it very well because my parents every day they were putting it into my head, from today your name is Thomas Vida, not Thomas Reichental. If you tell to somebody that you are Thomas Reichental, we will be betrayed and terrible things will happen to us. Again, my parents wouldn't tell me what the terrible things were. I was always ignorant. I was the child in the family. So, but every day, again and again, they told me, your name is Thomas Vida, and so I can remember it still today. And so, in September, we moved from the village. It was my brother, my mother, my brother, and myself. My father stayed behind because he had to look after the farm and the livestock. He said, look, I know people in the village, they will notify me if the police will be around, and I will be okay. Because at the time, the Slovak people hated the Tiso regime. So we got quite a help from the local people. They wanted to help us, so he said it will be all right. And we left for Bratislava, where we were supposed to pick up my grandmother, my mother's mother, and go to live to this new village, pretending that we were Gentiles, nobody knew us, and that way we might live through the war and survive. But we were only a couple of days in Bratislava when we were notified that my father was arrested. He was betrayed by a person from the village, and he was taken away. My mother thought, that's it, we will never see my father again, because at the time, as I said, we knew what was happening. But as it happened, my father did survive. He managed to jump from a train, and the carriage that was taking them to probably Auschwitz, and he left with two other men that jumped from the train to the forest where they met partisans, the resistance army, and he fought against the German and survived the war. Of course, we didn't know. We only got a postcard from my father once when we were still in Bratislava, where he wrote 4 words: "I'm alive, don't worry." We didn't know where it came from and what happened to him. But as I said, he did survive. In Bratislava, when my mother went to collect my grandmother, she put us, my brother and myself, in a photographic shop and told us to wait, and on the way back she will collect us. But when she went to collect my grandmother, it was a laundry shop. She saw her in the shop. There was police. She was betrayed. She was beaten up. She was a lady. She was 76-year-old at the time. It was very old age. They knew that she couldn't look after herself. They beat her up, and she gave the name of her daughter and son. So when my mother entered, she saw her brothers and sister, and she saw her mother all bruised and beaten up. She knew something terrible happened, but they realized from the document that she was the daughter of my grandmother. How they realized that was that the priest changed their name, Reichental, but he didn't change the maiden name. She was born Shaimovich, and of course my grandmother, her name was Rosalia Shaimovich. So when they saw she was born Shaimovich, they knew that she was the daughter, and she was arrested. When they opened the cases, they found children clothes. They told my mother, "Tell us where the children are, otherwise we beat you up, and in the end you will have to tell us." And so the next thing, we were sitting there with my brother. These 2 tall men entered the shop. They had leather coats and swastikas on the left arm, hat and boots. We knew right away it was the Gestapo. They came to my brother, said, "You Jewish?" And my brother said, "No, I'm not Jewish. My name is Miklos Vida." We thought with a name we will be saved. Nobody will suspect we were Jewish. But of course, they knew who we were. They just wanted that we tell them that we were Jewish. They asked him again, and again he said, "No, I'm not Jewish." And the next thing, they started to beat him up. And he still wouldn't tell them. My brother was 13-year-old at the time, quite tall for his age, and he wouldn't admit. So the next thing, they looked at me and said, "But you are Jewish." And I said, "No, I'm not Jewish. My name is Thomas Vida." Again, they asked me a couple of times, and next thing, they started to slap me in the face, kicking me and beating me to the chest. And I was crying, I was hurting. And my brother was very protective of me. And when he saw it that I was being hurt, he jumped up and he said, "We are Jewish." And we were taken then to the shop, and there we saw that 13 of us were arrested from the family. There were my uncle, there were aunt, the 2 cousins were there, of course my grandmother, my mother, brother and myself, all together 13 of us. We were taken to the Gestapo headquarters. From there we were transported to the detention camp. In the detention camp, they did the selection. I don't know if you heard about the selection. What it meant was that a high-ranking German officer would take family by family, and he would say, "You go on this side." These were the young men and women, people that were able to walk, and mother, children, all people to the left side. At the time, the adult among us, they knew exactly what it meant. The people on the right side will go to work in some working camp, have a chance to survive. The people on the left side, the children, old people and mother, they were destined for the gas chamber. And it was on the 2nd of November 1944 that we were called to the roll call. And the man that was responsible for the selection, his name was Alois Brunner. He was a high-ranking German. He played a god. He decided who is going to live and who is going to die. So when our family came in front of him, 7 went to the right side. They were uncle, aunt, one of my cousins, and 6 of us, which was my grandmother, my aunt, my cousin, my mother, my brother, and myself, we went to the left. And you can imagine at the time, we knew, well, I didn't know, but the adult among us knew what that meant. So you can imagine the atmosphere. We were thrown into cattle cart and taken on a long ride. The 7 on the right side, unfortunately, went to Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen. Buchenwald was a slave labor camp. The inmates worked there 12 hours a day. In winter, it was November, December, January, in freezing cold with very little food. So the life expectancy in Buchenwald was between 2 to 3 months. So out of the 7, only 1 person survived. It was my cousin. He was 15-year-old. The others perished in the slave labor camp. But at the selection, all this happened very, very quickly. You go there, you go there, you go there, you go there. And so when we were separated, my aunt couldn't even kiss her husband and say goodbye. We just waved to them goodbye, not realizing that it was the last time we saw them. It just happened so quickly. We were taken in a cattle cart. About 50 of us were in it. The conditions were unbearable. From 1 minute, as a civilized people, we turned to be like animals. There was no privacy. There was a barrel in the middle of the carriage, open barrel with a couple of buckets that served the toilet. We had a little water for drinking and little food, and we were traveling like this for 7 days. So you can imagine people were crying. 1 person died in our carriage for the first time. I saw a dead person lying in front of me there. I was only 9-year-old at the time. And 7 days we were crunched in one place. The stench was unbearable. Occasionally the train stopped at places. The barrel was emptied. We got some water, drinking water and food, and continued. There was no hygiene. We couldn't wash ourselves, nothing. It was 9th of November when the train stopped, middle of the night, the door opened and we were greeted with shout, heraus, heraus, schnell, schnell, out, out, quickly, quickly. We were taken on a march which lasted about 2.5 hours, not on the road, but through a forest, because obviously they didn't want to show the population what they were doing to the Jews. And just as we were nearing the camp, we saw this tall chimney with glow coming out. So you can imagine what the adults among us were thinking. At the time already they knew about the gas chamber, they knew about the crematoriums. So they were thinking, that's where we are going, that this is the last minute, hour that we're walking on this earth. So you can imagine the atmosphere. I remember my mother squeezed us to her body, my brother and myself. We were very worried about my grandmother because she was an old lady with all this marching in the soggy ground. It was very difficult. And we went through large gate. There were watchtower on each side with soldier in them, with machine gun. Very, very frightening. They brought us to a hut and told us to go sleep. We just fell on the bed because we were crunching this train. So just for the first time, we were able to stretch ourselves. And it felt like a couple of minutes, and next thing, shrieks, heraus, heraus, schnell, auf Zählapil, out, out, quickly, to a roll call. And at the roll call, we were told we were in Bergen-Belsen. But at the time, we didn't know when Bergen-Belsen was, what Bergen-Belsen was. We discovered later on that Bergen-Belsen was built in 1939 as a detention camp for soldiers that were captured by the German army, mostly Russian, Polish, and it served as a prisoner of war camp. But in 1941, the camp was changed to a detention camp for mostly Jews. It contained about 25,000 people. Most of them were Jewish, but they were also Jehovah's Witnesses, and they were gypsies, and they were also German political prisoners. They were not treated any better than we were. And it was a detention camp, Bergen-Belsen, not an extermination camp. The crematoria was there to burn the bodies, the corpses that of inmates that were dying every day. People were dying in Bergen-Belsen due to disease, mainly typhoid, but diphtheria and tuberculosis, also due to starvation and cold. People were starving. What we saw in Bergen-Belsen when we arrived, we can describe only one way: hell on earth. We saw these skeletons walking around. They were just skin and bone in the striped uniform. We didn't know if they were men or women. They had shaved heads. They were just, as I said, skin and bone, skeleton. They had no attributes that would show if they were men or women. A couple of days later, we discovered that we were in the women camp, and we were where the hospital was. So these women that we saw were the inmates from the hospital. The hospital was not there to cure people, but the women that were brought there basically were brought there to die. They were in a state of dying. So as children, we used to play outside, and these women used to walk very, very slowly. And they were very, very ill. They were dying. And occasionally they fell down. And as we were playing and she fell down, we would stop playing and we would watch the woman. if she will get up, because we knew if she got up, she had another day or maybe a couple of days more to live. But if she didn't get up, we knew she died. And this used to happen every day, several times, because these patients from the hospital, they didn't cure people there, they just kept them there to die. They were dying, and this used to happen, and most of them never did get up. So we actually saw people die in front of our eyes, and it was something that, as children, we stopped playing to see what will happen, because we were sorry to see what was happening, and we were watching them as they were dying. The day that we also discovered that every day there was this special commando that used to go from hut to hut, picking up the corpses of people that were dying. If somebody died, they went in, they picked the corpse one by hand, one by leg, they threw it onto the cart, and then they were wheeled to the mortuary, and from the mortuary to the crematoria, the chimney that we saw. The crematoria was there to burn the corpses for the obvious reason, because at the time still the Germans thought that they might win the war, and they could say then after the war that in Bergen-Belsen nobody died because there was no graveyard or graves, and because the corpses were burnt and the ashes were thrown around. Our day started with a roll call, and the roll call was in the morning. We're talking now November, December, January, very, very cold. We had to stand there from about 7 o'clock till 8, till our supervisor arrived. The supervisors were SS women, young women, in the 23, 24, 25-year-old. They could have been daughter of my mother. They were very, very cruel, because the SS had a motto: don't show any compassion. It's a sign of weakness. And they did not show any compassion. They beat every day. And we used to see people were being beaten, they were being shouted at, insulted with, you are so and so, why you don't doing this, why you doing that. They never talked, they always shouted. And we used to hear these shouts coming from all the directions. It was a terrible, difficult time. And of course, the food that we had was very little. After the roll call, we had breakfast, which consisted of 2 slices of bread and black coffee. And then we had lunch, which was turnips. They were cut into inch square, and boiling water. That was our lunch. And in the evening, we had 2 slices of bread and coffee as well. Occasionally we got a jam or margarine as an addition to it. This food was every day the same. We had no menu different. That's what we had at every day. And that was not sufficient to sustain a person. When we go scientifically about it, today, as normal people, we would eat about 2,300 calories. People that work hard, or sports people, they even eat 3,500 calories a day. Our intake of food was a little over 600 calories. 600 calories is equivalent to 6 water crackers. So we lived on 6 water crackers every day. That can't sustain you alive. And therefore, for the first 1 or 2 days, you still survive somehow, but then you begin to be very, very hungry. And you starve. And we didn't starve for a day, we didn't starve for a week. we starved for months because all the time we thought about the food. That every time when you got something to eat, you were thinking when you get your next meal, because you were hungry. And after the next meal, you were thinking about the next meal. So the body begins to eat itself from inside. You're getting skinnier and skinnier. Eventually you become like a skeleton, and finally you die. It's a very painful death. It doesn't happen overnight. It takes weeks and months. So some of the inmates, they just couldn't bear the pain of dying. And during the night they would run towards the perimeter, start to climb it, and the guard would see them with the light, with the searchlight, and they would shoot them. So these people, they didn't try to escape because they knew they can't escape, but they just wanted to end it. In other words, they committed suicide. And we used to hear these shots being fired during the night. And in the morning, all in our own section, because the camp was a huge camp, there were about 80 huts. In our section, we would every morning see 2 or 3 corpses on the barbed wire that were shot during the night. They just committed suicide because they couldn't bear the pain, what was happening. So their life was very, very difficult. People were not working in Bergen-Belsen. They were, it was a detention camp, and therefore people basically were there dying. They were tortured with all this starvation and what they were doing to us, standing in freezing cold outside, and anything that they could do to us to make our life more difficult. But in January already, the German army was losing the war, and they were retreating from the west to the east. And as they were retreating, they were taking the prisoner with them. And so, for example, Auschwitz had to be evacuated. In Auschwitz at any time, there were over 150,000 slave labor, basically. Auschwitz was a slave labor camp, but it was also, of course, extermination camp. More than 1 million people died in Auschwitz. And so many of these people from Auschwitz came to Bergen-Belsen. And they were not transported because the railway line were destroyed, the roads were destroyed. They were taken on marches. During these marches, they were huge, thousands and thousands, 10,000 in single march, 15,000 in single march. And thousands of them died on the way. And therefore these marches earned the name, the death marches of Auschwitz. And many of them came to Bergen-Belsen, about 35,000. So the population of Bergen-Belsen over a very short period grew from 25,000 to over 60,000. So there was no room for these people. They put them in the huts that were built for 150, 200 people. Suddenly there were 600, 700 people in one hut. And so many people in such a small space. Epidemic of typhoid broke out in Bergen-Belsen, and people began to die in thousands per day. 500 people were dying in February, March, and April. 17,000 per month. The crematoria no longer could cope with that amount of corpses, so the corpses were just thrown out in the open. We had a little area, a grassy area, where we used to play, and suddenly there were a pile of corpses. But as children, we continued to play. And I never forget when we played hide and seek, for example. We didn't hide behind trees or behind walls. We hide behind pile of corpses. So you can't imagine, you were actually looking in the eyes of these dead bodies. And these bodies were decomposing and rotting away. So the stench around us was horrendous. When the British Army was 2 miles outside of the camp, before they entered the camp, they said the stench was unbearable. And we lived in the middle of this place. By the time we were liberated, it is estimated between 20 and 30,000 corpses were lying all around us. Bergen-Belsen was built in the middle of a forest, and among the trees all over, there were lying corpses 3-4 feet high. So you can imagine 30,000 corpses. It was an open graveyard. The stench unbearable. We got used to it. We couldn't even smell it. But at the time we knew that the liberation is very near. But unfortunately we still suffered a terrible tragedy, and it was on the 7th of March 1945 when I woke up in the morning and I saw my mother and aunt were crying, and I asked, "Why are you crying? What happened?" And they told me that my grandmother passed away. And this morning, like always, this Sonderkommando came. They asked if somebody died. They led them to my grandmother. She was like a little baby, just skin and bone. The one picked up by hand, one by leg, that she was thrown on the car, wheeled out and thrown on the pile of corpses outside. I remember about 10 minutes later I ran out to see where my grandmother was buried, but of course she was buried under other corpses. I never saw her again. So it's something that I carry all my life, this memory of this day when my grandmother was, how she was treated when she died. Well, the liberation came on the 15th of April, 1945. It came very suddenly. There was rumble on the street, middle of the camp. There were jeeps and lorries and tanks coming through, and the British Army, they shouted through the loud herald, "This is the British Army. You are being liberated." We didn't even know what liberated meant, but we knew we were free. I remember only at the time that the inmates, they were standing there, it was all very subdued, because, as I said, most of them were 90% were mortally sick. In fact, after the liberation, still about 12,000 inmates died because they were just too far gone and they couldn't save them. I have a couple of things that I want to show you because the time is running fast. First of all, when the British Army came in, the camp with jeeps. In one of the jeeps was a film crew, a military film crew that filmed the entry into the camp. And this film exists today. When you see any program about the Holocaust and there are any archive film, most probably what you see are the archive film from Bergen-Belsen. It was one of the most horrific places that was liberated at the time, with so many corpses lying around. And this is one of the pictures that I have from the jeeps that as they were passing and filming. And why do I have this picture? Because this boy in the top here, it's my brother. And I'm somewhere there as well, but I can't recognize myself. So this is the moment that we were liberated. This is the moment that the British Army was entering the camp. So we have a memento from the liberation. I don't show the picture of Bergen-Belsen. They're very distressing. But I want to just show you one of them, which shows you how dehumanized we were at the time. And this picture is also after the liberation. And you see here some of these women sitting there. They are cooking something and they're going to eat. And what you're seeing here around, and it's about 5-6 feet from them. It's all around, right around them. These are all corpses. These corpses are not there from yesterday. They're there for weeks and months. So you can imagine the stench. And these women are smiling and they're going to eat them. They don't even notice these bodies lying around. This is how dehumanized we were at the time. I want to also read you a witness description. This was a medical team that was being prepared to enter the camp, and they wanted to just tell them what to expect. The next morning, 17th of April 1945, on a parade, our commander officer addressed us. He had visited the horror camp. Bergen-Belsen was called the horror camp because it was so horrific what they found there, and corroborated the rumor. It is unbelievable, he said. There is no organization, no food, nothing. Half-starved, emaciated, spiritless. Demented, these people are roaming the camp, have been reduced to animal level. I went through the women quarter of the camp hospital. Many of them are stark naked, are literally crawling around on the hands and knees, too weak to walk. They're bedridden, just skin and bone, lying undone. In one small room were 40 women, few with any clothes, huddled together to keep warm. Some of these women have been dead for days. Nobody had come to dispose of their bodies. I have seen some sight. I thought I could take anything. But this shook me, made me vomit. Outside, the dead are piled 4 feet high over a large area, and bulldozers are having to be employed to shovel these bodies into large pits. I could tell you more, even worse, but it is too sickening to talk about. That was Bergen-Belsen. I have also a letter here from Reverend Morrison. I just want to read you 4 lines from the letter. He was a chaplain in the British Army, and he was Irish, and he wrote this letter to his sister, Nora Birmingham, from Ballysimon, County Limerick. I just read 4 lines. So far I have buried over 15,000, and I have not been able to attend our funeral, as I consider the dying more important than the dead. Those 15,000 did not take much of my time, as 10 graves held up to 5,000 bodies each. Burying 15,000 didn't take much of his time. Today, if you go to Bergen-Belsen, you have these mounds that are burial places, and they might be as long as this hole here, and there would be a note, here are buried 10,000 corpses. Here are buried 5,000. Here are buried 2,000. A horrific sight to see it. But unfortunately, and that's what happened in Bergen-Belsen. I finished my lecture with a couple of things. First of all, we have to realize that today Ireland is a multinational society. And Holocaust did not start with gas chamber. Holocaust started with whisper, with sound, with dubbing, later abuse, and finally murder. I'm not suggesting such a thing can happen here, but we have racism in Ireland, and especially in school we find things that happen, some children bullying some other children because they're foreign, or because they're different religion, or because they're different color of skin. And if you see something like this happening, don't become a bystander. Get involved and say it's wrong and stop it. because unfortunately at the time when it was happening to us, people became bystanders. Nobody did anything about it. And look what tragedy eventually happened. So it's very important as young people, this is what I'm speaking to young people. We have to stop this hatred and racism and xenophobia at this stage, because when we grow up, it's too late. And it's up to you to welcome the foreign people that come here, and you know, they have different way of living, they do different things. We have to let them live their own life and help them to settle and become a useful citizen of Ireland, contributing to the Irish economy. I also want to mention that the Holocaust should never be forgotten and never be compared to anything else. Holocaust was a unique event and we can't compare it to anything. So I do my part to make sure that it's not forgotten. I speak to people, to young people, traveling all over Ireland, abroad, and bring the message of tolerance and humanity. I want to finish with a poem which is very appropriate to this lecture. It was written by Yehuda Bauer in 2001. The horror of Holocaust, it's not that it deviated from the human norm. The horror is that it did. What happened might happen again to others, not necessarily Jews, perpetrated by others, not necessarily German. We are all possible victims, possible perpetrators, possible bystanders. Thank you very much for your patience. Now, I don't know if you have time for any questions. If you we take 2 or 3 questions, just to always need the first person to. Yes.
After all the tragedy that ensued, what helped you find your purpose in life again?
You have to tell. Did you?
Could you repeat the question again? Sorry.
Yeah.
After all the tragedy and everything you'd seen at the detention camps, what helped you find your purpose in life again?
After you saw the tragedy in the camps,
I live by a proverb which says, make peace with the past so it doesn't spoil your present. And that's what I did. I made peace with the past. I don't carry any hatred, because hatred is a double-edged sword. It's not only the people that you hate, they probably don't even care, but it's really in you that you suffer from it. So I made peace with the past, and I always look to the future, and I had a good life afterwards, thank God. I did not have any nightmare, or I always look forward and try to do the best.
Any other questions?
Did you meet any of the Nazis afterwards, and what?
Well, I actually wanted to meet somebody. I made a film about it. She was an SS woman in Bergen-Belsen. She killed 2 people. They were witnesses. She stood a trial in Lüneburg in Germany. It was the first trial after the war. There were 42 guards from Bergen-Belsen put on trial. 12 were sentenced to death. Among them was the commander of the camp, and 19 were sentenced to different length of prison, and the remainder were acquitted. And among these that were sentenced to prison was this woman. Her name was Hilda Lisiewicz. I researched her from her childhood till she was in the camp, and she gave a lot of interviews in the later years, and I got in touch with her. I wanted to meet her, not to forgive her. I can't forgive, because the people that should forgive is the people that are no longer among us. So, but I wanted to make reconciliation, because in all her testimonies that she gave to various historians, students, and she gave a very long testimony to the archive of Bergen-Belsen. In none of them ever she showed any remorse. She never said she was sorry or anything like this. So I wanted to meet her as one of the last witnesses, the last victims, and one of the last perpetrators. And I was hoping if she meets me, I didn't want her to speak about the past or anything. I just wanted to hear from her that she has some remorse, that she is sorry. But in the end, she was not prepared to meet me. I was prepared to shake her hand. I had a long correspondence with her daughter, and I was in the last moment, I'll never forget it, we were in Israel in the airport on the way to Hamburg to meet her. And in the airport we got an email from the daughter, "We don't want to meet you." So we went to Hamburg, we filmed near her house and everything, but I never met her.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah?
Were you the only member of your family that came to Ireland, or did your brother come to Ireland as well?
No, I was the only member. I didn't come as a refugee to Ireland. I came here to set up a factory, a zip factory, for industrialists from England, in fact. And when I came to Ireland, it was in end of 1959, I did set up the factory here. It took a long time, but anyway, I did set up a factory, and during the time I met a Jewish girl, and we fell in love, and in the end we married, and I'm still here. But the post note that I like to say is also that my wife passed away in 2003, and in 2005 I met another lady, a Jewish lady, Joyce. She's actually with me here, but she has a terrible pain in her back, so she couldn't come to the lecture. We together since then, so she's my partner. So I'm a very lucky person having somebody. Yeah?
Did you ever meet any other Holocaust survivors?
Yeah, I did, because I was in Bergen-Belsen for inauguration of a museum. And of course, we stayed in hotel. All old people, all of us were in their 80s and 75, 80. And we started to talk to each other, and suddenly I speaking to this man, and it transpired that he was in the same block with me. So he lives in Israel. There was another man that I met, who's from Slovakia. He still lives in Slovakia. I'm in touch with him. Also, I thought I know him from Slovakia, and when we were speaking, suddenly we realized that we were together in Bergen-Belsen. So I did altogether about 4 people I met that we were in the same hut in Bergen-Belsen. Yeah.
Where do you think the hatred for Jews came from in the Nazis, or why do you think the Nazis hated Jews so much?
Well, there is many reasons, but I never forget. I got this question in my first film, I did 3 documentaries. In my first film, it was my autobiography, and we were in Bergen-Belsen filming. And at the end of the film, I say sort of, why this happened, why? And I say, it just stayed, why? But there are, for example, people still blaming the Jews for crucifying Christ. That was one of the reasons also that the hatred come out, that what we did was terrible. But at the time during the war and before the war, nobody ever knew the natural fact. Christ was a Jew. Not only he was a Jew, he was a rabbi. So now we know it all, you know, we learn in the school and everything. So this is one of the reasons. There was also a reason of jealousy. Because the Jews were not allowed to work in hand work, Jews became doctors, lawyers, accountants, and they did very well, and they became wealthy. So the other population were jealous that these Jews, they don't work, and they're getting rich. But it wasn't our fault. I became an engineer. It's a different attitude. We could work and do our own things. When you're thinking about Israel, the technology that is going on there, and the high-tech and everything. So the Jewish people are very industrious and entrepreneurial people. But before, in the years of the 16th, 17th, 18th century, Jews were not allowed to work there. So they got these jobs in the big castles. They had jobs to taste the wine, for example. You were not allowed, again, and they were considered very important at the time when all these aristocrats, or, you know, the leader, the Jews would taste the wine, that it's not poisoned and that it's a good wine. They got jobs like this, and jealousy was created. That's nothing. In Slovakia, for example, the jealousy was very, first of all, the Christ thing was big, because it is very Roman Catholic place at the time, and today still, and they become jealous that the Jews have all the good jobs. So when this Jewish Codex was introduced, for example, they said, I think in Slovakia there was about 80% of the doctors in Slovakia were Jewish. And we were only 3% of the population. So of course, the people that study and said, they have all the good jobs, we can't get them. So when they introduced this Jewish Codex, they reduced the percentage, I think, to 2%. They allowed 2% of doctors to be Jewish. So all the doctors were sacked from one day to another, because they were Jewish, and so that the Slovak people could take over these practices. So there are many other reasons, but look, today you have anti-Semitism in Slovakia as well, in my own country, and out of a population of 95 Jews in Slovakia, only 17,000 survived. Rest of them perished in the Holocaust. Today in Slovakia, there are less than 1,000. In Bratislava maybe, they're talking about 300 Jews in Slovakia. And still, they're blaming the Jews for their trouble. So there are no Jews in Slovakia, but there is still anti-Semitism for the little minority. They're all old people. They have nothing to do with anything. And so it's why? I don't know why. Yeah. Okay.
And last year in the States, in Charlottesville, when there was the Nazi rallies, did it kind of make you think we as a people are going backwards because it's so accepting for people to walk down the street with a flag that has such a horrible history behind it? Did that resonate with you?
In Charlottesville in the USA last year, when the far right kind of Nazi rallies were there, did it bring back a lot of memories, was it?
Yeah.
Or was there something else to it?
Did it kind of like resonate with you? Made you feel like we're going backwards?
Did it resonate with you when you watched those marches? Did it say
Yeah,
that we were
well,
going backwards?
that's the terrible legacy now in Europe with all these refugees, the right-wing parties and everything. I mean, they're marching on the street in Slovakia, for example. They're marching and they're fist up and they're shouting, Slovakia for Slovak, Slovakia for Slovak. I saw these marches in the 40s, also with the fist up, with the same ideology. Our people today, they suffered so much. In Poland, 3 million Polish people died. And you have a big anti-Semitic Nazi parties in Poland. And I'm not talking about Jews, the 3 million Jews as well, 3 million Poles died during the war from Nazism and fascism. And today you have these thugs going and shouting and using the same slogan, using the same ideology that in the 40s. It's just person can't digest that how it can happen. For example, in Slovakia, in the town where the uprising happened, which is called Banská Bystrica, where the uprising happened, a mayor was elected who was the leader of the fascist party. I mean, fascist party today. These are the people that are marching with them. So when I was there, I actually wanted to interview him, and I rang, I sent letter to him to make an arrangement to speak to him, to ask him a couple of questions. He wouldn't meet me. He was obviously afraid because he would have to admit. He admires Tiso. By the way, Tiso was tried in Slovakia in 1947, and he was hanged for crime against humanity. Not necessarily what he did to the Jews, but what he did to his own people. So you sort of ask yourself, you fought, you rose up against the fascism, and you are electing a fascist as your mayor. And I'm saying it on the film. History turning upside down. I just can't grasp how this can happen today. But this is what is happening. And in America, of course, as well. There's in the campuses, in the school, there is a lot of unease because there is a lot of the students' union against the Jewish student and everything. So it's very hard. In France, many Jews are emigrating to Israel from France. Actually, the government is begging them to stay. They will do everything to pressurize the anti-Semitism and getting laws out and etc. But Jewish people are being attacked in Europe, and there are the ugly things that are happening. In Hungary, it's a terrible movement as well. Poland, of course, with the new laws they introduced, you are not allowed to say that the Poles did anything wrong during the thing. It was all the German did. But the Poles were collaborating. They gave the Jews, they passed them to the Germans. Of course, Auschwitz was not a Polish concentration camp. It was a German concentration camp. But it was the population that collaborated with the German that caused such a high number of Jewish people that perished in Poland. So it's a big problem.
Where did you and what remained of your family go after Bergen-Belsen?
But
Where did you and what remained of your family go after Bergen-Belsen?
after Bergen-Belsen, we returned to Slovakia. And actual fact, I met my father about July 1945 for the first time in Slovakia when we returned. We lived there for a couple of years. It was in February 1949 that I was the first from the family to emigrate to Israel because I didn't feel welcome. When we come from the concentration camp to Slovakia, we come as refugees because we come from the western part of Europe, the part that was occupied by England, France, England, America, and Canada, that occupied the western part of Europe. Slovakia was occupied by Russia, and then, of course, the Cold War. So when we come from the western part from Europe to Slovakia, we come as refugees. We were not welcome as Slovak citizens. As I said, we lived in Slovakia for generations. That was my country. I should be living there today, and I should be dying in Slovakia. But we were not welcome. I remember at the time people were saying, oh my God, more of them are coming back that were taken away. And as I said, out of 90,000, only 17,000 survived. But that was the atmosphere. Still the people were poisoned with the propaganda that they had to swallow during the fascist regime of Joseph Tiso in Slovakia. And then, of course, the communism was coming. They were not very sympathetic to the Jews either. So I said, this is not my home. And I emigrated to Israel, and then the rest of the family came in July 1949. They come after me. But I go now to Slovakia quite often. I love it. And I always go to the village where I grew up. And it's a very interesting feeling. When I come there, I feel like I come home. And I said this to my brother. I said, you know, it's amazing. When I come there, I grew up there. You know, as a child, I had a beautiful life, and I always call it, this was my paradise. We really grew up very nice, And my brother said, you know what, when I go there, I feel the same. So it is, we still have this connection. When there is a football game between Ireland and Slovakia, I have a little problem. Yeah.
Did you ever find your faith was challenged personally?
Yeah, I'm not a very religious person. I go very few times a year to the synagogue. I don't keep what we call kosher, you know, we're not allowed to eat porks and things like this. And every time, like traditionally, we wouldn't keep pork in the house. But when I'm out, like this morning, when I had breakfast, I had an Irish breakfast. You know? So I like to have a little bit of sausages and bacon. You know? So I'm not. You see, there is something in this when you're asking, because when we were there and what was happening to us, and people were praying. I mean, they were religious Jewish people praying to the God to help them to survive and everything. And we were asking, where is the God? Now we need him, you know. So it's a little bit of a dilemma for me. But I many times I speak to religious people. I speak to our rabbi here and things. And I say to him, you know, I said, how do you expect me to be religious when I went through all this? And this was one time we needed help. And where was the God then? But he just said, you here. Why are you here? You know. So I sort of said to myself, maybe there was somebody looking after me, you know. Yeah. You had better stand up. Yeah.
Did you ever attend
in school again?
Oh yes, of course. As I mentioned, when I come from the camp, I went to school in Slovakia, and I had to, sit with young children because I lost all my basic education. But yeah, I went to college and I studied, and I did quite well in the end.
On all of your behalf, I want to thank Tommy for telling what is a very, very difficult story and an emotionally charged story, and he held us in the palm of his hand over an hour, telling us a compelling story of human misery and human degradation. And I really regret that you're condemned to remember, which is to borrow a phrase from yourself, because it is very difficult to recount that level of dehumanization and that whole very harrowing part, because any one of us that has had a difficult period of our life, we want to always place distance between ourselves and it. And for you to relive that every time you tell this story must be really emotionally draining for you, but equally very, very generous of you as well.
Thank you.
I'm particularly pleased that the advice Tommy gave you resonates so well with our own 3 rights as a citizen of Kinsale Community School that these students enjoy. And that is the right to learn, the right to be happy, but the right that you spoke of this morning is the right to be different. And those 3 rights are core to every student's citizenship within our school community, and I'm really pleased that you spoke in particular of the right to be different.
Absolutely.
I'm very, very grateful to Kinsale Peace Project because Ger, Lisa Podrick bring these guests to speak to the student body of our school and cause you to reflect. This was due to finish at 12:20, and morally I could not stop this at 12:20 because this was a magic educational moment of very rich learning that you were engaged in. And no bell should put a bounds to that. And I'm really pleased that we did extend it and that you did glean the benefit from meeting this person, as I introduced him, as having significant historical importance for us and for our lives. So on everybody's behalf, I regret that you're condemned to remember, but thank you so much for your generosity.
Thank you very much.